I think people don't know that I'm most likely the biggest patriot on this podcast.
You love your country so much.
Like, I have a collection of just exclusively English minerals. I'm absolutely in love with British birds. Like, where is the right? They need to sign me up.
That is genuinely the most uplifting and heart-warming moment I think we could end this podcast on today. Hello and welcome to this week's Life of the Party, a deep dive into everything to do with your party, the Green Party, a New Left Party, maybe even sometimes controversially the Labour Party, whichever party we'll end up being a part of.
I'm going to kill you, Joe.
I am your host. I am your host, Joe Todd. And here I am with my friends and my comrade Shanice McBean.
Hi.
And Jonas Marvin.
Good morning, Matty Goodwin.
Oh, ChatGPT Nazi. Okay, it's big week. It's a big week in the life of left-wing political parties in the UK. We have a lot to talk about, so without further ado, I think Shanice is going to kick us off with a news section.
I am. So it has been a huge, historic week in left-wing politics in Britain. And I think the most significant thing is obviously the Green Party victory in the Gorton and Denton by-election. So just to break down everything that happened in the run-up, it was deemed to be this really close three-way race between the Greens, the Labour Party and Reform, with the Labour Party saying at multiple points that it's only the Labour Party that can beat Reform. The actual result was that Greens absolutely annihilated both Reform and Labour, coming out at 41% of that vote. So 14,000 people voted for the Greens on the day, 29% for Reform, so that's around 10,000, and then 25% for Labour. So Labour's vote share collapsed by nearly half. And they went from a majority of 13,500 in 2024 in the general election with 51% of the vote share to 25%. And you've got to put this in context because this has been a Labour safe seat. Although it was reconfigured in 2024, it's been a Labour safe seat for many, many years, and it's been held by Labour since 1931. So this is a stonking and historic victory for the Greens, who are now able to add their fifth MP to their parliamentary party, their first Northern MP, so they're breaking into kind of new political territory, and their first Westminster by-election victory. And again, a little bit of context, Zach Polanski has been doing the media rounds and he keeps emphasising the fact that Gorton and Denton was 127th on their list of target seats. So, not absolutely at the bottom, but nowhere near somewhere that they would have ordinarily have put lots of resources in, and they won it. So this is really, really significant. I think maybe kind of the biggest, or at least one of the biggest political consequences of this election victory for the Greens is that Labour are no longer credible as the anti-reform tactical vote. Richard Seymour talks about this really powerfully. There's something psychological that's been broken here, this stranglehold, this political threat that, the only way that you can beat Reform is by voting Labour. And that has now been politically, psychologically crushed as an idea. I think it also empirically and numerically confirms that Starmer and McSweeney's strategy of turning Labour into a reform-light party has irreparably damaged the Labour Party, its brand, and its electoral positioning. And of course, we know on the ground that the question of the genocide in Gaza, anti-working class legislation coming out of the Labour Party over the past year, its authoritarianism, it being the paedophile party now in its kind of, defence and hiring of Mandelson, and just the lies and dirty tactics that have been at the heart of their election strategy in Gorton and Denton, particularly in that final week, was just an absolute no for the voters there. So again, I think some other important kind of political questions to draw out is just the permeation of racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia that has kind of come out since the election victory. It wasn't even at the point of the kind of results being called. It was as the polls closed that there were starting to be whispers on social media from kind of right-wing actors and Reform that there was family voting. And just to kind of say a little bit about what the accusation is, the contention is that Muslim men essentially are patriarchal and have been corralling the women and young people in their families to kind of vote in a particular way. And this is obviously kind of dog whistle. In fact, it's not even dog whistle, it's very overt racism. Then kind of when the election result came out, then you start getting really overt accusations of sectarianism, of block voting, of the Greens kind of pandering to the Muslim vote. So obviously there's a lot that we can say about how kind of racism has been at the heart of this election, both from the right and from the Labour Party. So Paul Mason, Keir Starmer, in his kind of, don't even know what to call it, but he sent out a note to his MPs that accused the Green Party of sectarianism. So this narrative is kind of at the heart of how the right and the Labour Party are trying to rationalise the loss. And obviously, you know, accusations of sectarianism in context are nonsense. We're talking about, yes, there was a swing of Muslim voters voting for the Green Party, but they were voting for a Green Party who fielded a woman candidate in a male job as a plumber for a party that was led by a gay Jewish man. So not quite the typical Islamic sectarianism. But all off the back of this, there's been kind of a huge, or at least the beginnings of a political fallout with Matt Goodwin or Matt Badloss threatening to stand again. Threatening to stand again at the next general election. But actually, I think as a character within Reform, he's much diminished after this loss, quite discredited. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think my prediction is that he'll probably lurch much further to the right and kind of use Islamophobia and ethnic nationalism as his launch pad for kind of like a renewed attack on the Muslim community. But I think, you know, at the heart of this story is the fact that the Greens achieved an absolutely tremendous victory with a huge ground game. So there are reports that on the day of kind of the election, there were maybe 2,000 Green canvassers out on election day, completely outflanking Labour and Reform. So a lot of lessons clearly being learnt here from Zoran Mondani's field campaign. And this obviously is a resource that was unlocked by the fact that they now have a huge membership of nearly 200,000 members. In response to that, the Labour Party have said, you know, the Greens have been able to kind of pull out numbers that they wouldn't be able to pull out at an election. I think there's something in this, you know, the Green Party, although it was, you know, quite a desperate response to a loss, the Green Party aren't backed by millionaires and billionaires. They are a party that, you know, at its heart is resourced by its members. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out in later years and whether they can replicate that when they're fighting in multiple seats. But a huge victory nonetheless. And I think the political implications of this are going to be quite far-reaching. And one of the kind of, I think, consequences of this are big questions for what this means for your party. So this week was also a big week for your party. Your party concluded its Central Executive Committee elections this week. And actually, I think it's worth saying that quite surprisingly, at least surprisingly for me, the elections saw quite a huge turnout of membership engagement. So 25,400 people ended up voting in the CEC election, which actually, absolute numbers, is more people engaged in the CEC elections of your party than those who voted for Zach Polanski in the Green Party election. And we, you know, lauded that election as really high engagement, you know, really historic for the Green Party. So I think we have to really, you know, congratulate and celebrate the kind of high levels of engagement. It really goes against some of the fears that people had around kind of a very online based political culture, where people would be disengaged and the leadership will be able to kind of mobilize disengaged members to vote en masse in their kind of favor. And I think we've got to question that narrative a little bit. 62% of verified members voted in this election, which actually does put the membership figures, or at least the verified membership figures, at around 41k. So that's much less than we were expecting. But we have to remember some members might not be verified, so that might be kind of why membership numbers feel so low. But I think at the heart of these CEC elections, so just to break down what actually happened, we had 14 members of a 24-member CEC were elected aligned to the many faction, so Corbyn's faction. We had 7 elected that were aligned to the grassroots left faction, and 3 independents, with potentially at least one of those independents aligned to the many. So we're talking about a huge majority on the Central Executive Committee for the many and for Corbyn's faction, and ultimately for Carrie Murphy. But I think there's another dynamic at the heart of this election, because while we talk about, we might talk about high engagement in the voting, there has also been, I think, unstated high engagement within your party at the branch level. Branches are organising on the ground. I saw a really, cool meeting that's being advertised in your branch, Jonas, with BLM, Black Lives Matter, linking up with your party in Stoke to kind of run meetings and educational meetings. There have been Birmingham bin strikers who have been speaking at your party events, and your party members going to picket lines. Your party has been quite a disproportionate force in the Palestine solidarity movement, actually, compared to, the kind of ground game in the Palestine solidarity movement for the Green Party. So your party is active in social movements, I think, far, far beyond the Green Party, for example. And I think this then has consequences for how the CC election has played out. Because the grassroots left slate, I think almost represent this base, this activist layer, this cadre within your party. So although the grassroots left slate might not represent a majority on the CEC elections, it is still the case that they represent a significant voice of the membership at the branch, at the activist and at the cadre levels. So I think off the back of this election, there are going to be real questions around, although the many will be able to push through a lot of their agenda at that administrative and structural and institutional level, how they interact with the membership and the base is still going to be a significant question. Ultimately, there is no your party without its members and without its branches and without its base. So grassroots left is down but not out. But I think taking these 2 elections this week, one of the big questions for me, at least, and I'll wrap up here, is what does the Gorton and Denton by-election mean for your party, and what the point of your party actually is? The Green Party outflank your party in terms of progressive social politics. We're talking about the Green Party has been able to break into a significant section of the Muslim electorate in the north, which is one of the political ambitions of the many faction, wanting to so-called hold our multiracial coalition together. And the Greens have managed to create that coalition and have achieved electoral success off the back of it, whilst also overtly and explicitly having trans-inclusive policies. So, if I think of myself as a voter and I'm in a position where there's a Green candidate and a Your Party candidate, and I want to, vote for the party that has a mass base, has mass appeal, has a charismatic leader, can hold a multiracial coalition together whilst also having political principles, I'm not going to be voting for your party in that situation. So I think this raises, significant questions about what is your party for now? So yeah, Joe, I know you were on the ground in Gorton and Denton. What was the vibe like?
There's so much to talk about. Sorry, I'm still totally high from the last couple of days of campaigning. Yeah, so I was in Gorton and Denton for a few days, and I campaigned across 5 different bits of the constituency. So Levenshulme, which is the kind of working class Muslim, but also gentrifying area with, like grads and professionals and stuff in the west of the borough. Longsight, which is the more heavily Muslim bit just north of that. Burnage, just south of that, which is more kind of families, kind of bigger semi-detached houses. Gorton proper, and then the northeast bit of Denton. So yeah, I managed to see a lot of the constituency and also walk around a lot of the constituency. My thighs were exploding after the 2 days. And yeah, I mean, I have so many reflections. I think one big one is just that the Green coalition that came out to vote was just everybody in different ways. Like, you obviously went to the kind of like the posh Edwardian fronted streets in west of the High Road on Levenshulme, and yeah, they're all voting Green. Like, those houses are like bleeding green, But as are the back-to-back red brick terraces in Longsight, as were some of the bigger semi-detached houses in the bit of Denton that I went to near Reddish North. Like, it just wasn't. You'd knock on a door and it'd say G1, so it'd be like definitely voting Green, and you'd be surprised by the person that opened it often, because you'd be like, oh, you're not in my head like a typical Green voter, you're not necessarily part of the coalition. So it just really was the case that the Greens managed to turn out like a multiracial cross-class coalition. You had van drivers driving down the street beeping in support of a Green candidate. Like, come on,
Nice.
like, it's weird. Like, there's a car mechanics that had Green posters all over the front of it. So it just was like really, really cool in terms of the coalition that they managed to build. We can talk about it more later, but I think Hannah as a candidate was just like a massive part of that. It's also the case that I found way more Green Reform switchers than I did Green Labour switchers. Like, loads of people balancing whether to go Green or whether to go Reform, and I think this is just more evidence that we have to see politics in this kind of people versus establishment framing or axis rather than left versus right. Like, most people do not have a coherent left-wing politics or a coherent right-wing politics, and we have to understand that as activists and as political people that think about this every day. Like, we're the weird ones in this regard, and we have to not be surprised when we go out and talk to voters and find chaotic politics where people are, picking from left and right and wherever like that. That's normal. And the way to understand it is a lot of people are just very angry with the political class, angry with the establishment, and if we can be the ones to capture that insurgent energy rather than Reform, we'll do really well from it. So yeah, just loads and loads of that. I think that the numbers really were there for the Greens quite early, and I mean, it really just puts paid to the idea that any of the kind of like mainstream political pundits or lobby journalists know anything about their job, to be honest, because it's like, you had all of these lobby journalists just like repeating the Labour line that like, well, Keir Starmer wouldn't be going to the constituency 2 days before the vote if he weren't confident that he were going to win or whatever. But if you just dug into the Green numbers a bit, which if you hung around a canvas or two, you could essentially get access to, you could see from the day before polling day that we were now targeting 13,000 households, which were either G1, G2, G3, so definitely Green, probably Green, or maybe Green. We were estimated to have 1,000 to 2,000 canvassers on election day. I think in the end it was somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000. So that's between 13 and 26 houses each to knock up and turn out, which is not many houses for a whole day of canvassing. It was the case that if it's going to be a tight three-way, then you need probably about 10 or 11,000 votes to win, which is what I estimated before. And then you look at the election, and that probably was the amount of votes that you needed to just win. And you just put all of this maths together, and then understanding that although not all of those 13,000 households are going to break for you, there's obviously more than one voter in many of those households, and many of those households are going to vote in the same way. It's just quite clear that the numbers were there for the Greens quite early. And I don't know, I was quite bullish about it for a number of days, and people were telling me to shut up and stop jinxing it. But I just think the numbers were there, and it's quite satisfying, I suppose, when you can just add promises to ground game, and you're like, oh yeah, we probably do have this. I think the other thing I'd say though, and maybe this is just, well, I've got so much more to say, but I think the other thing I'll say now, and this is just like maybe like running against what's been said elsewhere, is that we have to recognise Labour did have a lot of people out. Like, especially on polling day, there were Labour canvassers everywhere. I have no idea who they are, like who would be knocking for the Labour Party now. I'd rather boil my own head than knock for the Labour Party, but they seemingly managed to find people that wanted to knock on doors for the Labour Party. And although their vote did dramatically reduce in percentage terms, they weren't completely left in the dust like they were in the Caerphilly by-election. Like, I think in the Caerphilly by-election, they ended up on 2,000 votes, something like that. 3,000 votes, sorry, which is way behind Reform's 12,000 votes and then Plaid's 15,000 votes. Whereas here, they were very close to Reform, like 9,000 votes to Reform's 10,000 votes. And I don't think we have data on it yet, but I think that, at least from my anecdotes, like decent chunks of the Muslim community did stick with Labour as well. Like, there's definitely some breaking towards us, but like decent chunks did stick with Labour. And although I do think this does represent an existential crisis for Labour, I think we should be wary of overemphasising that, in that they weren't completely destroyed. And I think you can just squint and see a possible kind of like reconstitution of Labour under a Burnham-like character. Like, I just don't think that's impossible at all.
What's that like a Lenin misquote that everyone knocks up? There are decades when fuck all happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen.
Yeah.
And I really felt like that throughout this kind of last week, like that kind of a singular political event where a range of political processes just bear out.
Yep.
For sure.
And it really felt like that. Yeah, and it's a rare thing to say in politics, but this was the best result possible in this context, and it's warmed my heart. But it's when we're thinking about how huge this is, there's two details worth highlighting: the combined insurgent vote, so that's the combined vote of the Greens and Reform, was 69.4%. The combined traditional vote was 27.3%. Labour had their biggest single loss in terms of shift in voter percentage ever in a single seat. The Tories lost their deposit, got 1.9%, weren't barely a feature in this election. It's just remarkable, the kind of times that we're in. The Greens have never got more than 10% in a by-election before. Now they're third favourites for most seats, according to bookies, with a 17.5% implied chance of winning. We're going to talk, Shanice has talked about your party already, but I think it's just worth, in this Gorton and Denton case, really demonstrating something, which is that the Greens here capitalised on the left-wing pro-Palestine coalition that we witnessed in the general election in 2024 and hegemonized it. That point about the kind of psychological threshold having been crossed is just really important. The green ceiling now is much higher than it had been. There are caveats that you could say to that, and I think we should say to that. I'm more skeptical than Joe, for example, about the potential for Labour to reorganise. I think it's right. I think the caveat to say that the kind of decline of political parties doesn't happen in fell swoops and that there is chances for reorganisation is right. But I guess I look at the internal stasis within Labour and the kind of blockages towards Burnham being able to stand, and also other soft left candidates kind of just continually discrediting themselves. I mean, Lucy Powell, for example, over the last 2 weeks has hardly covered herself in glory, and I find it difficult to see the opportunity for renewal. But I wouldn't deny it totally. But one thing I do want to say is that, as much as I kind of relish Matt Goodwin's just absolute humiliation, I think Reform's embrace of Toryism, Britannia Unchained style politics, is starting to bear some rotten fruit here. The kind of getting loads of ex-Tories, right-wing Tories into your kind of shadow cabinet, if you like, and into the kind of higher echelons of your party is not good. And that, I saw kind of anecdotal evidence of that coming up on the doorstep in reports. And, we can all talk about how they stood a bad candidate in a seat the right doesn't typically do well in. But I also think, there's this kind of broader question to me about how this will translate in the future. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit more in the hot take, is that there are, specific advantages. I went back and I listened to the episode when we called Matt Goodwin a loser and when we made a bunch of claims about why he would lose. And actually, so many of those claims really stand up because there's all of the kind of political stuff about the candidate and the campaign and where the Greens are at and where Reform is at. but there's also the specificities of the area. And I guess this is one point to Joe's thing about will the Greens always be, a psychological threshold has been crossed, but will the Greens always be in every seat the party that's able to stop reform? I'm not sure yet. Like I think the jury is out on that, particularly, for example, in places like where I live. That that needs to be borne out, basically. One thing I want to say is that there was a kind of interesting dynamic that very few people have talked about in this last kind of week and a half, which was there was an interplay between the electoral anti-fascism of Hannah Spencer and the Greens' campaign and street anti-fascism in Manchester. There was a big Britain First march in the city last Saturday. They were outnumbered by anti-fascists. There was an attack on a mosque during the campaign. But that kind of, the people look at the letter that Goodwin got told off for putting through people's post boxes. It read like Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. Like a lot of the imagery came across in a very similar fashion, just as lots of the moral panics afterwards did. So I think, there's a lot going on there about an interplay between fascist street violence and the electoral far right. And the fact that there was a kind of demonstrative example of the far right being held on the streets last weekend, and then also the far right being defeated at the polls, is really good and really encouraging, and we should try to learn from that as much as possible. But obviously this all just raises so many questions for your party, and I think we have to be really honest about that. I thought, cards on the table, I thought the result in the CEC elections was a good result for the grassroots left slate. You guys will know, and I think I said this on previous pods, that I didn't think they do particularly well. I didn't think the campaign was great. I think particular individuals ran a good campaign, but I don't think the campaign as a whole was great. Peace and Justice Project, we're sending out emails like every week. Big email lists to Corbyn supporters, who will likely be your party members, saying, come and vote for Corbyn, make him your man. The guy still has a huge resonance, and there's a huge reverence for him amongst your party's support base and its voter base. There's the kind of ways in which the party's democratic system, I've seen Archie Woodrow talk about this online, kind of had been constructed to benefit the many slate in particular ways. And then I think something that really hurt the grassroots left slate campaign was the fact that this was the point in time, this CEC election was the point in time where the gap between Zara's past political declarations as a Labour MP and her radical pronouncements started to catch up with her, and people started to kind of see a bit of a dissonance there. The questions for me are this: is the many slate going to see this as an opportunity to get rid of parts of the far left? That's an open question. The kind of, we've talked about in the past about how the dual membership motion that was carried at your party's founding conference could be interpreted in different ways. I think we might see some struggles over that interpretation. And Corbyn, I think, has, in a good sense, like in a good way, talked about how your party wants to be part of a left flank offensive in alliance with the Greens. The problem I obviously have with that is, what is your party's role in that? If the Greens are hegemonizing the coalition from 2024, what is your party's distinctive role in that? Like there's a problem, I think, with trying to think that Corbynism 2.0 is going to be something that swings elections in local contexts and in national contexts. And I think something that the Greens just do so much better than your party, even though, for example, in this by-election, policy wasn't particularly high up the list of things that were being discussed from the Greens' point of view, is they have a future thinking agenda. They have a message discipline. They have a sense of what the short-term goals are. And I just think your party and the group around Corbyn in particular are just a bit meandering at this stage to see, in terms of a political vision, to see where the kind of electoral fruit might lie.
Yeah, I want to emphasize a couple of those points because I think they're really, really crucial. There were so many things about the Gorton and Denton by-election that I saw glimpses of Zach and his team really learning from Zoran Mamdani's campaign. Some ingredients for success: a charismatic candidate that actually speaks to the identity and the aesthetics of the area that they're in Zoran's case, New York, in Hannah's case, Manchester. And understanding that they also need to appeal to their progressive and left base in terms of the language that they use the policies that they advocate for, and the social political principles that they advocate for as well. So Hannah did not renege on the question of race and migration. But the key thing, again, the lesson from Zoran Mamdani, is you marry that to a clear and powerful economic program that both understands that racialized minorities and kind of majority ethnic groups are part of the same class, but also targets the ruling class, the millionaires, the billionaires. So she had all of these ingredients in her campaign. And there's a couple of these areas that your party don't have. First of all, the charismatic leader. I know I have harped on about this a couple of times on this podcast, but Corbyn has a very loyal fan base. And I think it's that fan base that ultimately meant that he got 14,000 votes for the public office holder in the Your Party CC elections. And Zara Sultana got, I think it was around 8,000 votes. So he nearly got double the amount of votes that Zara Sultana had. So he clearly holds this legacy of popularity and fandom within the Your Party membership. But that doesn't translate nationally anymore. He's not a particularly popular national figure. And Zach Polanski's absolutely trouncing it on that level, at that scale at the moment. You know, he's more charismatic, he's more likable, he's bombastic, he sticks it to the journalists, he sticks it to his political opponents. He's got a sense of fire and gusto about him that, you know, really feels insurgent. So that's one thing your party doesn't have. But the other is the politics. So remember I said, you know, one of the key things about Zoran Mamdani's campaign is that he didn't abandon his left progressive base. The whole stuff that he did around the Department for Community Safety, closing Rikers Island, fighting against ICE, all of that was to appeal to his historic activist base, you know, in the movements that he's been part of, Black Lives Matter, etc. And your party, I think, particularly with the composition of its CEC, there are some transphobes on there, or people who have more transphobic kind of political persuasions. And the many has also committed to essentially being silent on key political questions that have dominated politics over the past few years, whether that's, you know, trans politics or kind of certain questions around kind of race and racism. And it's decided that its strategy is going to be silent on those in order to hold this kind of coalition together. But that just gets completely blown out of the water in terms of what happened in Gorton and Denton. And I know I mentioned this earlier, but I really want to emphasize this point. The Green Party in kind of Mothin Ali's deputy leader election, I think really shows how they've managed to hold both now an external coalition of kind of progressive people with, you know, kind of radical social ideas and Muslims together, both externally and internally. So, for example, they had a trans councillor called Jenny Knight, who is actually the chair of Trans Young Greens. She backed Mothin Ali's deputy leadership campaign. And they've had their raucous kind of rows and debates on kind of trans politics. And they've been able to hold an internal coalition together and translate that to an external coalition. How your party thinks that essentially sidelining some of these key political questions and sidelining its cadre and activist base is going to translate to a successful socialist project on the ground, I've got no idea. And, you know, I think it's essentially going to position your party to the right of the Greens in between Labour and to the left of Labour. And I'm just not sure that that's going to lead to any kind of winning electoral strategy, let alone the impact that is going to have on holding the party together internally. To me, it just seems like, you know, a powder keg ready to be lit.
Yeah, I mean, to give the case for your party and for the many people who are obviously now in charge, is that, I mean, they point to Corbyn's kind of like unique favourability amongst Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities in particular as like a real asset that they have. And, you know, like they sent me some polling, which actually is really interesting. It's political favourability ratings by ethnicity from October 2025 done by YouGov. The ones on Keir Starmer are fascinating. Everyone hates Keir Starmer. According to this poll, everyone hates Keir Starmer, apart from black people, where he only has like a -1 favourability, which actually really surprises me, but maybe makes sense if you think about Labour's historic vote in cities. And then Jeremy, white people hate Jeremy. Yeah, like genuinely, but he has like a plus. But he has a plus 33 point approval rating, specifically with Pakistani and Bangladeshis, which tracks onto working class Muslims. Not always, but often. And I think this is the argument that the many would make, is that, well, you know, Jeremy still does have this quite like particular appeal amongst a certain community. And if you can align him with, you know, like Muslim community interests in Leicester, in Birmingham, in Bradford, and then also bring along with you some of the kind of independent councillors in different places that broke from Labour and are kind of either kind of ideologically wary of the Green Party because they'd see the Green Party as kind of irrevocably liberal in some way, then you have like a viable force. I buy that this could result in a couple of seats at the next election. I don't really buy that it's not something that could be done by the Green Party and could be folded into the Green Party. And, you know, my desire for your party or a socialist organisation that's not the Green Party was always something more like the Democratic Socialists of America, where you can have like a broad left group that organises everyone that's a socialist, whether they're doing electoral work or non-electoral work, and you wouldn't run candidates as that organisation. So it'd be an organisation rather than a political party. That's not going to happen now with your party because of who's in charge. Like that's not going to be the outcome. But yeah, I really hear you. I do struggle to see why the stated purpose of your party now couldn't just be folded into the Greens. Now the Greens have broken this kind of psychological barrier, as we say. And I just want to come back on Hannah Spencer, because, you know, she's clearly a brilliant candidate. She's like, you know, she's charming, she's funny, she speaks really fluently, she speaks from the heart. And she is, if you haven't heard, a plumber and a trainee plasterer. And I do want to dwell. Yeah, I know, right? No one's talked about it. But I do want to dwell on that a bit, because it can seem trite reducing people to a certain aspect of their identity. You know, their job is one of those. But it is just the case that Green parties internationally and also historically have drawn from the professional classes, right? And if you look at the Green Party now and the Green Party's representatives now, you've got Zach, who's previously an actor. You've got Carla Denyer, who was an engineer. You've got Adrian, can never remember his second name, but he used to be a CEO of a charity. It's like professional class. You know, it's professional class, and you meet their activists. I met tons of them over the weekend, and it's a lot of like professional class people who have worked in charities or like their managers and offices and stuff. And this is fine. This is like a legitimate section of our base, and I'm not trying to denigrate it. But if the party is going to build beyond its current coalition, roughly, you know, Muslims pissed off by Gaza, downwardly mobile graduates, I know we say that phrase a lot, but downwardly mobile graduates, and kind of like rural, nature-loving middle classes, then if it's going to build beyond those three bits of its base, it's going to have to run people that don't look like parts of those base and find opportunities to emotionally and symbolically reconfigure the party in the national imaginary in a different way. And I think, you know, people who work in trades and people who drive vans, I do not know if Hannah drives a van, but it feels possible that she might drive a van.
White van Han.
White van Han. Oh, that's good. Yeah, they should do that. but people who work in trades or who drive vans and stuff have always had such an outsized kind of emotional and symbolic political influence in this country. Yeah. We all remember Emily Thornbury going to a constituency and taking a picture of a white van outside a house with an England flag in it, and then saying, "Oh, this is disgusting," or whatever. And she literally lost her job in the cabinet for that, or in the shadow cabinet. I can't remember which, but she literally lost her cabinet role for that. And there's a real kind of material basis for this, because what you call the petty bourgeoisie, so, you know, people who they don't work in a kind of unified workplace, like a collective workplace, but they work as a sole trader in some way, maybe a small business owner, have always been this kind of mobile class that has aligned with the left and the right in various times. And our electoral geography privileges rural areas and small towns does just give these people a lot of power in the country, you know, and that comes through in lots of political sociology in various different ways. And if the Green Party can start to be the party of tradespeople and parts of the petty bourgeoisie, like Mamdani did, by going on the halal cart owners and the bodega owners and using the fact that they have real cost of living pressure on their lives and on their businesses, but also, face racialized violence from the state because a lot of them are Muslim or South Asian. Then that is just incredibly powerful for us, and there's a huge potential broadening of the coalition there. And I saw it play out on the doorstep. Like, I saw people almost roll their eyes when I say I'm from the Green Party, and then I'm like, oh, but Hannah, our candidate, she's a local plumber, and the the expression in their face would shift a bit, and they'd be like, oh, and the idea of, like, I think a local plumber both becoming a politician, but also becoming specifically a Green politician, was disruptive of what they thought about both politics and the Green Party in like a very positive way. So yeah, I just think if the Greens are ambitious and want to become more than just an urban and suburban party and maybe win more than 50 seats, which I now think should be the floor, frankly, they're going to have to run more Hannah Spencers, and they're going to have to find more Hannah Spencers and put effort into finding more Hannah Spencers.
If I may, I also want to take this a little bit off the electoral landscape, because obviously there have been elections this week. So, elections and electoralism is at the center of kind of how we're thinking about these questions. But let's also not forget that your party wants to be a socialist party and therefore wants to effect some kind of socialist transformation. And I think there are some key parts of their strategy that don't enable that. So I think where I really sympathized with the grassroots left slate is the fact that they had much more of an emphasis on kind of, even though I don't think they communicated it very well, they had much more of an emphasis on what kind of politics do we want this party to have? What are the messages that we want to put out into the world? How do we want to shift the political narrative in this country? And I think that's a key part of the question of socialist transformation, is how do you win hearts and minds as hearts and minds, not just how do you hold coalitions together in order to win elections, right? And this is really important to the question of socialist transformation, long-term strategic thinking around how you change society. Let me just give you an example. I really love telling this story because I think it's so powerful. But my friend Pat Stack, big up Pat Stack. But he told me this story initially around the outdoor relief campaign and strike in Belfast in 1932, where Catholic and Protestant workers united on the single issue of coming together to kind of fight exploitative bosses and fight repressive policing. And they actually sidelined the question of colonialism and sectarianism and anti-Irish racism in order to kind of come together around this particular question of how do we fight the bosses, how do we fight the police? Now, when the campaign ended, those old sectarianisms, those old divisions, those old hatreds just came back because they weren't effectively dealt with. And the movement was divided. The loyalist organizations jumped straight back in. The state apparatus swept straight back in, and the movement collapsed. That, for me, is such a huge lesson for the question of socialist transformation. What we're trying to do as socialists isn't just win elections, or it shouldn't be, to just hold coalitions together long enough so that you tick a piece of paper on a ballot box and elect someone who's going to affect some change at a structural and institutional level. It should be to think about, how do we change hearts and minds? How do we change the structure of not just politics, but sociality, relationships, how we come together as people, and sidelining those kind of political questions, which the Greens don't do. So in some ways, the Greens are actually better at this ideological question of socialist transformation than your party are positioning themselves as. And I think, it's important to have this question at the level of elections and electoralism, but actually your party professes to want to be this socialist organization, but has no sense of what socialist transformation looks like. And I think that's actually where the grassroots left slate were right, that we need to be thinking about these political questions, not just in terms of elections, but much more deeply about what we want our world to look like.
I really agree with that point. It's worth saying that on our last episode, when we were talking about the CEC elections, we got a little bit of kickback because of our kind of frustrations with how things were mapping out and the kind of so much of the culture and the invective that laid beneath the CEC elections and kind of had been expressed. And, we were told that we just weren't discussing the political questions and the political divisions enough. And there are political divisions, right? Democracy, transliberation, kind of the more maximalist politics of the grassroots left slate versus the minimalist politics of the many slate. But the problem is so little of that was discussed. There's so little discussion in your party over the last 6 months about how you wed agenda for socialist transformation to a politics of the here and now, a politics, as you say, of Shanice, of winning hearts and minds as hearts and minds.
Yep.
And I think that's really important because, like, you just can't you can't defeat like the kind of personality politics of the many slate with a turn to maximalism. And I think there was that was a kind of broader problem with the left, and it's a self-criticism as much as it's criticism of anybody else of the left in your party. This is the point that you said on the WhatsApp chat of the Life of the Party chat, Shanice. So this is an exclusive, which is that the far left, to some extent, treated your party as something that could be easily conquered and based a lot of expectations on that. And that was kind of over-regged by the far left's growing relationship with Zara Sultana. And I think that was a massive miscalculation, and that people should have been thinking with their hats on, thinking about the longer term in terms of a struggle over your party, which isn't to say that the left in your party are totally responsible for how it's gone. I don't think that. We've talked endlessly about the difficulties there, but I do just think like you have to wed the goal of socialist transformation to the here and now of how people live their lives and how people feel class and race and oppression. And that wasn't done enough, because if you do that, you might begin to win a strategic argument for how your party could move forward. But it just wasn't enough of that. On Joe's point, which I also basically really agree with. I mean, I have caveats, which is I think that like a lot of what people call the petty bourgeoisie aren't the petty bourgeoisie.
Oh yeah, without doubt.
I think like
I'm not getting into the Dan Evans definition argument. You cannot. Dan will be our first guest and maybe only guest ever on the podcast, and then we can all grill him for the sake of everybody that argues about this.
But look, no, in some respects, I think it's important, right? Because I just don't, I think power is a central way of explaining class. I don't think a lot of plumbers and tradesmen and tradeswomen have an awful amount of power. And I think there's a question about whether you think tools that you kind of carry around to do your job, or like the car which an Uber driver uses to work, are means of production or an extension of your labor power.
100%.
And I think that's really important. But I think the point that you make, Joe, basically is right. And I would I would deepen it a little bit more and say that the left has to be thinking, the hammer and the sickle, the image of the 20th century left was the hammer of the worker and the sickle of the peasant. The left has to be today thinking about what are the strategic cross-class alliances, not alliances with the bourgeoisie, in my opinion, but I think that's a debate that we should have in a future episode. But the kind of alliances between the working class and fractions of the petty bourgeoisie and sections of the professional managerial classes can be part of a left coalition, right? Implicitly, in ways, the Greens are doing this.
Yeah.
Much more effectively than your party could dream of at this stage, and much more subtly, in a way that actually speaks to people's lives, the way that people conceive of themselves. And I think there's an interesting thing there about you encountering people on the door and those people hearing that Hannah Spencer is a plumber and having a second thought about the kind of implicit, actually explicit division between intellectual and manual labor in society.
Yes.
And how so many people who are manual laborers in society are completely shut out of making intellectual and political decisions. And if the Greens are pulling on that thread, that's so important, because that thread right there is something that can unravel so much of the bad culture that has underlied neoliberal politics in this country for the last 40 years. And I think is really, really important. One thing I want to say is that with your party, quickly, my thoughts are a bit scattered because we're doing two big news stories this week. One much bigger than the other, of course, but is that I think there's a difficulty that your party faces now, which is the thing doesn't work without its component parts. It doesn't work without having Jeremy Corbyn, and it also doesn't work without having the left, the people who are going to make branches a vibrant, dynamic place. The problem is they hate each other, and I don't know how you get past that. I really don't know how you get past that. I think it was in a Navarra piece where Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi, who was a kind of not on the grassroots left slate, but aligned to it and was elected onto the CUC, kind of talked about being optimistic that people are going to get their house in order and be nicer to each other and work together. And I really, really hope that is true. But it does need to happen. If not, there are problems for this organization. And a part of the thing that I've been wondering over the last few days, kind of provoked by a James Meadway piece in the Morning Star a couple of days ago, where he reflects on the Green campaign in Gorton and Denton, and he makes this argument, and I'm gonna read the quote. He makes the argument: the pattern has repeated across Europe. In Belgium, the Workers' Party, with its prehistory as a Maoist sect, now polls around 18% with rock-solid bases of support in the country's industrial heartlands. La France Insoumise, an organization formed by a sharp break not only with the Socialist Party, but also the once mighty Communist Party, and even France's significant Trotskyist currents, commands the left space. Sinn Féin, with its roots in the Irish liberation struggle to the north, is now the largest single party in the Republic of Ireland. In each case, it is parties formed without reference to the historic traditions and organizations of social democracy that are the most dynamic in the continent's left. There are ways you could trouble that, particularly in the La France Insoumise case.
There are lots of ways you could trouble that. I mean, it's such a sideline, but yeah. Anyway,
James is obviously arguing this to make a case that your party is not the vehicle and that the Greens are. And on electoral terms, it's obviously very difficult to disagree with that case. But I also think we have to ponder here the baggage of Labourism, either as a way of reproducing a mode of doing politics. In some ways, you could accuse the many slate of doing this idea that you could just put blocks together without speaking to hearts and minds as hearts and minds. I think that's a really good point, Shanice. Or as defining yourself against Labourism, as so many failed left projects have in the past, without defining a future-orientated left politics based on particular groups of the class and particular social subjects in society. And I wonder if that baggage has strangled your party from its inception, let alone the very real and live scars of the internal Labour battles of the 2010s. For me, the Greens will come to dominate the electoral sphere. And I think if your party mistakenly conceptualizes itself as one flank of the electoral insurgency, even though I take Joe's point about there being particular places, 1 and 2 seats where they could do well, I return to this question we've raised here before. How do we build left communist networks that can work across these organizations, that can produce communist cadre on a significantly larger scale, that stretches the space opened up by the Greens with organizing drives, with agitation, some rare electoral ventures, kind of mass political education, and crucially in a non-sectarian way? That's the question in my head at the minute, basically. I'm not saying we have to answer it today, but I think it's really important.
I think, there's a, not me with the philosophy again from episode 1 way back when.
Do it.
But there is a philosophical question for me here. Jonas, in fact, you alluded to the fact that we got a bit of criticism online for our overemphasis of the personal, but I don't think you can separate the personal and the political. I don't think these things exist.
For sure.
Separately. They're completely symbiotic and completely in tandem. And I think that's for philosophical reasons. History doesn't just march forward mechanically or march backwards mechanically. History moves when you have a combination of, I think, the right people in the right circumstances at the right time. So, classic example that always comes to mind for me is the Haitian Revolution, which is, happening at the same time as the kind of shadow of the French Revolution, and the aura of the French Revolution is in the air. And you've got the circumstances in terms of the amount of slaves that you have in Saint-Domingue, and the distribution of the slave and the mulatto and the slave owning classes. You have those circumstances at the same time as you have characters like Toussaint Louverture, who are able to be shaped and molded by those circumstances, emerge as, really powerful and potent leaders to drive a struggle forward. So for me, history isn't made just by having the right circumstances or the right organizations. You also have to have the right people in those organizations. And history and moments can also be lost without having the right people, without having the right intellectual activity. And I don't mean academic activity, I mean intellectual activity in the Gramscian sense of a class that is able to understand itself and understand its possibilities and understand its limitations. All of these things have to come together, the right people at the right time, in the right circumstances, with the right organizations in order for us to win. And so, I think when we talk about the personal, it's because the personal matters, like the people that we have, the people that are leading us, how they do intellectual activity or lack thereof, mostly in your party, matters. These things matter. I'll leave it there. I'll leave it on a diss.
So if not the hammer and the sickle, the laptop and the van? I don't know.
Oh.
Well, I think conversely, it might be the stethoscope. It might be the stethoscope and the hammer.
Yeah.
Wait, who's got the hammer though?
The petty bourgeois
Hannah,
plumber.
obviously.
Yeah.
Hannah.
Hammer's got the hammer. Yeah. Okay.
Hammer
yeah,
Hannah. There you go. We sorted
Hammer
that
Hannah.
I just got one final point, which actually takes us zoomed out a little bit from these elections. In fact, a lot from these elections, which is just to raise the question of Gorton and Denton's great. We're all on a high. We're loving it. Matt Goodwin nearly crying when the elections came out. And you could see when he was standing there behind Hannah, just the tears in his eyes, and he was looking up, trying to hold the tears in. This is amazing. We love it. We're all ecstatic. There is still a question here, which is, do we yet have a project in this country on the left that has the mass working class base that means we'll be able to withstand some kind of future betrayal? Just imagine for a second we're in 2029 and the Greens miraculously win government. I'm not saying that's going to happen. It's not a prediction. But just imagine we're in that situation. Is the Green Party, as it exists now, going to be able to withstand all the pressures that are going to come its way domestically, internationally, that are going to mean that they don't betray their politics, their principles, and the working class at some point? Imagine the same with your party. Put either of those two in that situation, and I don't think we have a project that is actually going to be able to withstand some of those pressures that Syriza, Podemos have come up against historically. So I think that's just a lingering question for me. Although we're all on a high for this immediate victory, there is still a longer term project that we have to think about.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely do not have that organisation yet at all. We just do not, and it's more of a pressing issue for the Greens because it's now, it felt crazy predicting 6 months or a year ago that the Greens were going to consistently surpass Labour in the polls. After this by-election, it maybe feels more probable than not that might happen. We might well get into the territory over the next couple of years where predicting a Green majority or a Green minority government at the next election is not the craziest thing to say. So it is actually an issue for the Greens, more so than your party, because your party is just not going to be in the situation where they're governing anytime soon. And it is worth saying that the Greens, I mean, this is kind of why I keep pushing the idea of the Greens as a majority-seeking party. To do anything that the Greens want to do, they have to be clear-eyed and focused on trying to form a majority government, because if they're going to be propping up a social democratic Labour government, let's say the best case is that, say, Ed Miliband, who's probably the most left of any of the potential quote-unquote like left candidates within Labour for the leadership, is leading it. Say they're propping up an Ed Miliband government, like junior partners in coalitions always take all the flack because they've always got to compromise on some of their principles or some of their policies, and it's just a very hard position to be in. And I think realistically to kick off the process of socialist transformation, we're gonna need to be in a majority position, and that's why the Greens have to get serious about winning not just in 50 seats in cities, but in many, many more seats across the country. But then, it's like, what kind of organisation do you need? What kind of level of both like discipline and resilience and political understanding do you need amongst the activist base? How does your activist base need to be composed so it's, all parts of your coalition are kind of in the party and not just like passive voters? And, at the moment, the Green base is not representative of the coalition. The Green activist base is not representative of the coalition that it wants to build. And then do you have really like hardened leadership cadre as well across the members of parliament or all the other leadership positions in the party? And then do you have the structures that can withstand such a project? Like the Greens are very, very decentralized and democratized, and that's going to, in some ways, be just incredibly hard. So yeah, like there's an incredible project of building that we should all get involved with in various ways. I think the scary thing for the Green Lines, the scary thing / exciting thing for the Greens is just like the timeline might be radically sped up.
Just love how massive a question you just introduced, Shanice.
Yeah, I know. I was like, what the fuck?
Right at the end.
I was like, we're an hour and 5 minutes in. We haven't even done the hot take yet. And Shanice is like, do you think the Green Party is ready to enact socialist transformation in the UK? I'm like, all right, I'm going to try and answer that.
It's incredible. Maybe the hot take is out of the window.
Nah, mate. Come on.
No, I mean, it's fine if it is, because I think it's a really important question. Look, I'm not saying this because I think anyone here thinks this, but I just think it's worth stating. The Greens aren't going to produce a socialist transformation. Like, I think we just have to be totally honest about that. But they can radically shift things to the left in this country, potentially. With that in mind, and all of the kind of things that both you and Joe have said, how do you have, Joe's written about this before, how do you have that human chain which is able to defend and advance the gains of the left in government, in office, to protect it against the right, but also to push it a little bit further to the left when it is confronted with the kind of the blockages of ruling class power? It's a vital question, basically. And in the end, I wasn't able to go to Gorton and Denton because I have a sprained foot, which is a real shame of mine. But I would have loved to be there. And if there's a by-election in the future, I will be going out to canvass for the Greens, especially if the campaign and the candidate is as great and dynamic as it was in Gorton and Denton. But I do really think we need to conceptualize things like we didn't under Corbynism, which is as a division of Labour, which is that the Greens are going to be overwhelmingly focused on winning elections now. And to be fair, why wouldn't they? Because they seem pretty good at it. And I think other bits of the left have to be overwhelmingly focused on, yes, in particular places, trying to win candidacies for really good, really strong, really sharp, really principled left candidates. I can see where there could be a few openings for people in different places, but also on the kind of stuff we talked about before. And how do you make that kind of broader political window that the Greens have opened up and turn that into facts on the ground and use that as a space to embolden organising and agitation and political education? Because for me, at least, like, that's not contradictory to what the Greens may do in office if they prove resilient, because it may be that is the very bedrock of stuff that can protect them and hold them to account if they enter into office. And I think, different people have to do different things. And that's the kind of conversations that the left needs to be having in this current moment.
Nice. Okay. So that was definitely our longest news section ever, but there has been a lot of news. There has been a lot of news, and it's all good news. Let's move on to the hot take. So I think Jonas has a related hot take for us this week.
Yeah, okay. The left, in my opinion, needs a law and order story. Now, don't worry, comrades. I haven't been indoctrinated by the right. Matt Goodwin hasn't turned me into...
You've been chatting to Paul Mason.
Matt Goodwin and Paul Mason haven't turned me into a trad con. But it's clear that the right, from centre-right Starmerism to hard-right Matthew Goodwin, front-load crime, law and order when trying to achieve political hegemony and defeating the radical left. In this by-election, for example, we saw how Labour and Reform repeatedly degraded an already decaying political culture by having vans roving around the constituency, plastering Zach Polanski and Hannah Spencer's face with the message that the Greens want to, and I quote, teach our children to use drugs, including crack and heroin, and let our daughters be used for legal prostitution.
Just abominable.
Yeah,
this is
the government. The fact that the party of government is doing that is just fucking abominable.
Yeah, this is a classic playbook, though. It gets more and more extreme. The deeper the kind of crisis times of our moment get deeper, but it's classic. Stuart Hall and his co-author spoke about this in their book Policing the Crisis, talking about how the racialized moral panic over muggins in the 70s became a broader totemic prism into politicizing an array of anxieties over the permissive society in the 60s and the 70s, bending facts and realities to their own narrative and will. But why crime, law and order? Peter Linebaugh, an amazing historian of working class resistance and subjectivity, particularly in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, has argued that crime was a precursor to collective working class struggle in the early days of capitalism. Now, I don't necessarily think this is true today, even though it's clear we are witnessing and have witnessed over the last 15 years new moral economies among the population, shoplifting growing, shoplifting become a collective act in some instances, a growth of young people turning less to booze, for example, and more to drugs like ketamine and mushrooms. So I don't think crime is a precursor to mass working class struggle today, but crime is central to how stories and moral economies are built in politics on the right, particularly through the form of the moral panic. The right are keen to tell stories of crime because it underpins the legitimacy of both property rights and the wage, depicting populations seemingly surplus to ownership and work as the root problems of our ills, whether that's people with substance abuse problems, racialized minorities, the disabled, the list goes on. There's a More in Common report that came out recently, which says dissatisfaction, this is a kind of caveat to the story that I'm trying to tell, dissatisfaction with the police is often framed through their inability to deal with crime satisfactorily enough. So, popular frustrations with the police's inability to prevent drug abuse, antisocial behavior, so-called loitering, regularly rank higher as a concern in the North and the Midlands than they do in the bigger urban cities. This poses a problem for us. Class abandonment decline are felt differently depending on where you live. Ruth Wilson Gilmore's wonderful book, Golden Gulag, speaks about how kind of the surpluses in labour, land, finance and state capacity born from the end of social democracy were absorbed by what she calls a prison deindustrialisation complex. In Stoke, 8 prisons encircle the city. My estate is one of the city's poorest and unhealthiest, but also most multicultural. We're on the edge of the city centre. The police and the council corral drug use into prison cells, but also restrict it to our estate, where people with vulnerabilities and substance abuse issues encamp on the kind of nearby wasteland, a former industrial site. And in many situations, it is the abandoned heirs of kind of obsolescent industrial workers who have been made disposable by capitalism, who live in conditions now where they've also abandoned themselves in the process. The physical space of the city, abandoned land, ex-factories, high streets in decay, all dilapidated, houses empty, ex-industrial land polluted. Owen Hafferley has remarked in the past that the left does better in the bigger cities, in part because things change all the time. The people, the infrastructure, the effect of gentrification on physical space. Often for the worse. We know this about gentrification. We know this about so many of the things that happens in the bigger cities. But the notion that change is possible is ingrained into the cosmopolitan city. But contrary to, say, Karl Marx, all that is solid doesn't simply melt into air in a place like Stoke-on-Trent and other post-industrial parts of the country. And that mediates the scope for what people think it's possible. And it's in this picture where the kind of zero-sum declinist sense-making of neoliberal austerity make a really radical story about crime incredibly challenging, having to confront the growing temptation towards mutual recrimination and resentment based on people's lived experience. Now, in the political context today, Zach Polanski's Greens, I think, partly because of their social liberalism, their commitment to social liberalism, but also partly because I think their healthy receptivity to different kinds of movements and NGO insights are doing some of the work of unpacking right-wing narratives around crime and around drugs and around law and order. And frankly, I'm quite impressed by it. And it boggles the mind how the left hasn't in the past taken this much more seriously than the Greens do today. We need to take seriously, after the Gorton and Denton by-election, we need to learn from Corbynism that the right can re-pivot and re-articulate its coalition after defeats, often better than the left can, and that what may not have worked in Gorton and Denton could work elsewhere. So we need a confident story against criminalisation, which is key to unlocking the purchase that the right's attachment to both property rights and upholding the wage as ways in which capitalism is organised, the kind of purchase of those stories with the broader public. We need a confident story that can undermine that. We need to disrupt the divisions between formal and informal, between productive and unproductive, divisions which undermine class politics. You know, Marxists and abolitionists have long argued this. I would caveat the claim perhaps that we need, we need transitional stories that grasp that an abolitionist horizon might be largely remote at the moment, but that is something that the left needs to work towards. So leaning into a principled defense of the Greens' position on decriminalisation and legal regulation as a means to reducing vulnerabilities, interpersonal self-harm, and crucially for me, undermining the repressive state powers that have been mobilised throughout the war on drugs in this country is really important.
Yeah, it's. I think this is going to become, and in fact, I think this is part of one of my predictions. But the question of kind of law and order, crime, policing, carcerality, I think these are going to become increasingly central questions to both how the right tries to smear Zach as he goes from strength to strength, but also what's going to play out in social movements on both the left and the right. And I think it's just worth, fronting now that obviously the questions of kind of law and order that were coming out in the Gorton and Denton election were basically cynical attempts from the right to break up the Greens coalition by appealing to the social conservative of Gorton and Denton's multi-ethnic working class on the one hand, and also the squeamish middle classes on the other. So it's completely cynical. But working class people are contradictory, and working class people both hate and love carceral systems. You see this, for example, in the Black community. The Black community historically in this country have led the most powerful movements against racist policing, police violence, deaths in custody, really inspirational movements that the Black community have been absolutely at the heart of. At the same time, the Black community are also more likely than other communities to say that they support the police. Why is that? Because when you are at particular risk of social, political, and economic harm, you want to be protected. You believe that the state, you have a right belief that the state owes you some kind of protection from the vulnerabilities and the harms and the violences of capitalism. And I think this is where stories come in, right? Because the mistake that radicals and abolitionists make is to tell people that their concerns of being harmed under capitalism don't matter, and that their concerns of what their high streets look and feel like don't matter, or that, the fact that their house got burgled or there's someone smoking crack on the street corner, these things don't matter. These things matter. But it's the story that we tell. So some of you might have seen it. I was in conversation with Michael Walker and Dan Evans recently, and Michael Walker asked me a question, which is, isn't there a problem with the left's obsession with disorder? We valorized the 2011 riots and, we just love disorder. Don't you think that's, one of the major problems with your position on abolition? And my response was, actually, the most disordered thing, if you want crime and if you want disorder and if you want violence, the best way to achieve that is the system that we have now. And I actually took that kind of, I think, discursive point from Zach Polanski. It's how he argues it. The most chaotic system, if you want people to kind of go into prisons and come out and commit crimes again, the best and most chaotic system to achieve that is the one that we have now. And this is the story that we have to tell. If you want drug deaths, if you want people smoking crack in your parks and on your street corners, if you want people suffering, if you want antisocial behavior, the best way to achieve that is the current system that we have. So partly there's a question of storytelling here. How do we say to people that actually the current system is broken? It's the current system that's the problem, not the attempts to fix it. But equally, people are attached and attracted to this mythology that police stop the bad guys and police keep you safe and police protect the working class. And we know empirically that this isn't true, but it's a powerful story. And that's where organizing comes in. So I think as well as telling, really good stories, the Green Party and your party and socialists and the left also have to be good at organizing pockets of resistance that can create alternative discursive and ideological narratives. So for example, I talk about this one quite often, but there were attempts to bring down the levels of youth violence in Glasgow by taking a public health approach, and they worked. They worked, taking a public health approach that, took account of domestic violence in the home, mental ill health, housing insecurity, employment insecurity, targeting vulnerable young men and bringing them in to a public health approach brought down youth violence in Glasgow. So we have to make this practical for people. People need to see alternatives working in order for stories around, for example, drug decriminalisation to really start to be meaningful to people's actual lived experience of violence and suffering under capitalism.
Yeah, totally. It's just interesting that the Greens are going to have this argument. Like they don't have the option that Labour leaderships have of just essentially like tacking to the right on social issues such as this and trying to appease a supposedly authoritarian or supposedly like racist part of the electorate. In part because of the base of the Green Party, but also in part because of the structure of the Green Party. The Green Party is a democratic party. It is like governed largely by the motions that are passed at conference. Obviously, the leadership has the ability to communicate those motions in certain ways and synthesize them. But nevertheless, like it's a democratic party, both in structure and culture. So even if Zach wanted to, even if Zach decided, okay, I'm going to shift to the right on this issue because I need to cover it off, you kind of can't. So they do just have to work out a way, as you say, Shanice and Jonas, of making the argument on this stuff and communicating it well and convincing people and moving people and reframing it. And it's great to see that they're doing some of that work. Just to talk to the contradictory nature of working class politics and how people are trying to like struggle through with this, and also that when you knock on a door, you might not necessarily get what you expect. Knocked on one door in Denton, white working class woman answered, and she said a ton of stuff. We talked for a long time, and it was right the way from Emmeline Pankhurst died for my vote, so I think I should vote. Blah, blah, blah. I don't think Emmeline Pankhurst did die for a vote, but
she
anyway,
did not.
But anyway, she thought she was like Emmeline Pankhurst died for my. But it was literally from like Emmeline Pankhurst died for my vote, so I need to vote. But I'm not sure about all. I'm not sure about all the P-word people coming here, but maybe it's not their fault. I just don't believe the drug lies about you. And how could you open all the borders anyway? You don't own the world. And then this person voted green. She voted green. No, she voted green. No, she voted green. There was another one, knock on another big house in Denton, and it's a Muslim family opened the door, and the guy immediately brings up the drugs policy, and I'm like, oh shit, Labour's drugs policy has landed a bit, and Labour's drug attacks have landed a bit, and I think there was some evidence that it did. Like people were saying that it did come up on the door, and it was a good attack line. That doesn't mean we should triangulate, but it's just to recognise that it did have some traction. This guy was hilarious. He was like, yeah, I'm Dutch, and I see what they've done in the Netherlands, and it's great, and the prisons are emptier, and the economy is good, and we obviously should just like regulate drugs, and it's crazy that the drug system as it is, and I'm really happy that Labour have pointed out your drug policy because I'm now going to vote for the Greens because of it. And like obviously I don't think this guy is typical, but it's just to demonstrate that you don't like we have all these heuristics for understanding how people think and stuff, but they are just at the end of the day averages and generalizations.
Yeah.
And like when you actually go and talk to people, there's chaos and unpredictability and specificity, and it's just really fun getting to grips with that, I think.
People often, this is one of my bugbears about electoral politics and also how people think about politics. They assume people are these static, passive agents that they just think a thing. And we have to appeal to that thing that they think in order to bring them on board. And actually, people change their views. People are persuadable. People are movable. I change my views all the time on things. I learn constantly. And we have to realize that, politics is a movable beast. We just don't always feel that we've got the power to move it, but certainly people are persuadable. So when it comes to these kind of radical policies that aren't even radical because the status quo is radical, people dying from drug overdoses is radical, homeless people feeling that they have no hope other than to, beg for money for their next hit of whatever, smack or crack. That is radical. But when we're talking about policies, oftentimes people are like, we can't have radical policies because they'll put people off. I think you have to have a little bit more faith in people, in the human capacity for conversation, for persuasion, for learning. And we shouldn't interpret our weakness at persuasion as evidence of the fact that people can't be persuaded.
Yeah. I think that's a brilliant point. And that is a fantastic point.
Yeah, and it's also true that there are just plenty of people in society who love drugs, right?
Yeah.
And like for like not necessarily bad or harmful reasons as well. Like and like I think of politics, that says, oh, I didn't inhale, or that sort of politics is just like, it's just quite alien to people. Like, people do just like, a lot of people do just laugh at that kind of stuff. Like, as in like, isn't that a bit embarrassing? Shouldn't we take that seriously? Like especially in contemporary politics, where we know that there are swarms of politicians who are quite fond of drugs and are quite into drugs. And I guess that's something that we have to balance, right? Is that like, I think that actually Zach, over the course of kind of observing him over the past year, does like a really good job, I think, at balancing, which is that like there are loads of people who enjoy drugs and want to live a good life and want to have a good time, and drugs is a part of that, and that's fine. And then, but also there are loads of people who are in really harmful, life-threatening situations because of the relationship between drugs and their broader social conditions. Like we had a Tory MP, for example, in Stoke, Jack Brereton, some years ago now, talking about the kind of monkey dust epidemic that we have in the city. For example, in Staffordshire, which is the broader county, 50% of monkey dust deaths nationally happen in Staffordshire. So it's a real kind of epidemic. And he kind of talked about these zombies that roam across the city, completely dehumanizing these people. And I think part of the left's job as well, and this is why I'm really into what you said, Shanice, about what is the kind of social infrastructure, what are the kind of organizing experiences, what are the kind of policy demands that you can win that actually underline the kind of broader story that we want to tell about drugs and about crime and about law and about all of this stuff, is that a lot of these people who end up in, really horrible situations on my estate are our people. And you have to own that, right? And you have to own the complexities that come with that, the vulnerabilities and the harm that comes with that, and be able to deal with that, rather than thinking you can live in a society where you simply alienate and isolate and push those people out. The question I have is, how far can the Greens go on this? And also kind of what are the broader transitional demands around this for the left? They're the kind of questions I have, which I'm not saying we answer today, but I think are really important for figuring out the kind of the bandwidth we have on the question of crime and law and order and drugs in this society.
One quick thing that I'd just say on the Gorton and Denton case is that, if we're going to be precise, the attack wasn't really on drugs; it was on heroin and crack specifically.
Yeah.
And like heroin and crack, and giving your kids heroin and crack, and allowing your kids to have heroin and crack and stuff like that. And I think we've got to be clear-eyed about that, because I haven't seen polling on it, but I would bet the general population just sees different drugs in very different ways. Cannabis use is completely socialized amongst, I would say, middle-class people or graduates. Like the idea that you're dropping a pill or like taking some cocaine is like pretty normalized. And I think, as you guys have said, it's when drugs are linked specifically with crime or antisocial behavior or kind of like physical threat. I'm not saying correctly, but when they're done in political discourse like that, that's when they become more threatening and potentially more of a potent attack line.
I think as well, there's, again, this is a question of storytelling, right? Because you go to a festival like Glastonbury, Reading, any festival, and we know that Class A drugs are everywhere, and we also know that they're never seen it,
mate. Never seen it.
But we also know that, guess what? The police tolerate it. They know it's happening and they tolerate it. They tolerate it because they recognize that, well, it's just going to be too much of a burden to police it, and it's not going to be good for the local economy to police it anyway, because people go to festivals to take drugs, and people that go to festivals bring lots of money into local economies, and that's a good thing. And if you have some kind of, if you have paramedics and harm reduction things on site, which most festivals do, they have tents that you can go to if you're feeling ill and sick. They have paramedics roaming around. They have, soft places where you can like chill out and relax. If you have those on site, you're probably likely to reduce drug deaths and drug incidences anyway. So we have spaces, we have these decriminalisation zones that exist in society already. Parliament being another one. We know that. We know.
So true.
We know that in Parliament, for example, there was a few years ago a report that was done where they did swipes on the toilets in Parliament, and cocaine was found in majority of the toilets in Parliament. Another decriminalised zone. You're not seeing police raids and stop and search in Parliament, are you? So it's about, again, these stories that we tell. We know that people can safely take drugs and enjoy themselves and not be a risk to society or engaging antisocial behaviour in those environments. What does it tell us about working class life and how working class people are denigrated and suffering and disproportionately vulnerable to harm and violence in society, that they also can't enjoy, the thrills that the middle classes and the bourgeois class enjoys? And we have to tell that story. What is it about life that means working class people suffer when they take drugs? Some working class people suffer when they take drugs, and working class communities, have more stories of harm. And yet the middle classes and the ruling classes are able to take drugs without criminalisation.
And what does it say about the ruling class and the system that we live in? The particular worries about the idea that working class people might let off some steam and enjoy themselves and might embrace leisure. And that's where I think the real kind of prism of crime as a kind of thing that's there to police the wage and property rights becomes super important.
Yeah, I think just the final thing, I've been a big advocate of libidinal politics and kind of emotion on this podcast, but there are also facts. There are also facts, and I think we also need to, on the left, really highlight these facts, which is that crime is historically going down and has gone down over the last few decades across Europe. There are some exceptions to this rule. So sexual violence is an exception. Petty crimes like, shoplifting, bike thefts, these are exceptions. But in general, murders, violent crimes against people, these things have trended downwards for years. For years. That's just a fact. Another fact, police don't keep us safe. If you report a crime, very unlikely anything's going to happen, particularly if you report some of the most violent crimes like rape, sexual assault. Nothing's going to happen if you report it. The current system doesn't work. This is just a fact. And we need to get better at just highlighting how broken the current system is and how the mythology of what keeps us safe and the reality of lack of safety and vulnerability just don't match up. This is actually my final point. I do worry. I do worry about where this leaves your party again, because, if your party's strategy is to appeal to the more kind of conservative political positions of this kind of multi-ethnic coalition, it's not going to have a good position on these questions of crime, carcerality, drugs, youth violence, particularly in a context where Corbynism already heavily triangulated on these questions, with Corbyn at the time where he was Labour leader committing to kind of community police programs and more police on our streets. That worries me, because again, there's for me a question of, well, if the Green Party exists and they're pushing, the debate to the left and they're pushing for a better vision of what society looks like, the sorts of things that a socialist party should be doing, then what is your party for?
All right. Thanks so much for that, guys. So we will, as always, round off with the reading. Jonas, what have you been reading this week?
I read recently one of the best books I've ever read.
Wow.
Which is Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams.
Oh,
which
I'm just not going to read that though, am I?
I really recommend, despite Joe's wariness about psychoanalysis more broadly.
No. I'm actually really into psychoanalysis. I'm just struggling with dense books at the moment. But anyway,
okay. This isn't really a dense book, to be honest with you. I mean, it's a big book, but it's a literary classic, and it reads in some bits of it like a novel, because it's the recounting of people's dreams and the kind of interrogation of people's dreams and the kind of frameworks which Freud develops through the process of practice to kind of understand the different resistances and the different kind of latent and manifest dynamics that exist in people's dreams. And I just think it's a wonderful book. I read it as part of a class that I was doing for a few weeks on psychoanalysis and hysteria and the unconscious and dreams. And I really recommend it. And I think, something that I think we should return to in this podcast, and that Shanice has already brought up, like, we have to think about the unconscious as a terrain of politics in some ways a lot more on the left. And the interpretation of dreams by Freud is the kind of key place where you develop a methodology of what that means.
Cool, thanks. So I promise I will never do this again. But this week I have been out campaigning and thus doing very little reading. So I am going to recommend my own thing that I wrote for this week's reading. I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to do this again. But it's particularly relevant. The title is On the Ground in Gorton and Denton. I wrote up a load of reflections from the last couple of days campaigning there. Some of which we talked about in this podcast, but some of which we hadn't able to get in. And I just felt moved to do it because, journalists were saying such stupid and or obvious stuff. I think the best was Beth Rigby, who's, award-winning political journalist, political editor at Sky, said on Twitter after Hannah's victory, "What's so interesting about this is that some in the left of Labour, so invigorated by Corbyn, seem to have found a new home in the Greens." Imagine being a political editor and being moved to tweet that as if it were news, or if it were insightful, or if it were anyway, fucking hell. So I just basically wrote my experiences, and I just thought that there were lots of specificities that happened on the ground that are worth talking about. So yeah, I'll put the link in the show notes. I promise I'll never do this again. Shanice, what have you got?
So we haven't actually spoken much about this on the podcast, but I'm a serial hobbyist, and I have a lifelong hobby, which is I collect minerals. And over the past 5 years, I have really quite an elite and established collection of English minerals. I'm sure we can talk about that. I absolutely love English mining history. But one of my other hobbies is now bird watching. So guys, I can't tell you I've been reading anything other than the RSPB book on British birds. That's just what I've been reading. And it's because my lovely partner, we went to the Rainham marshes way out in East last weekend, and I saw 16 new bird species.
Which was the best?
I really liked the goldfinch, very colourful. But we saw loads of kind of water birds. We saw a curlew, we saw a godwit, a lapwing, just all these great water birds. And we saw a water pipit, which is this cute little water bird. And we saw a shoveler, which is this big, ferocious looking duck with this giant beak. Anyway, so I've just been kind of, I've just been enjoying just understanding everything that we saw by reading the RSPB book on British birds. Really?
That's so heartwarming.
Yeah. I think people don't know that I'm most likely the biggest patriot on this podcast.
You love your country so much.
I have a collection of just exclusively English minerals. I'm absolutely in love with British birds. Where is the right? They need to sign me up.
That is genuinely the most uplifting and heartwarming moment I think we could end this podcast on today. So thank you guys. Thank you, Shanice. Thank you, Jonas. That was so much fun. If you enjoyed that, please follow us on Twitter or on Instagram. You can email us comments, questions at podlifeoftheparty@gmail.com. And if you want to support us and give us some money to keep making this happen, we could buy new microphones. There's so many things we could do. Please become a supporter at podlifeoftheparty.uk. And as always, thank you to our one top tier supporter, Michael, who technically needs to be mentioned at the end of every podcast, because that is what we promised anybody at that level of support. So thank you,
Big up, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. You know who you are.
I'm not sure anyone's going to be convinced by giving us money because we need new mics, though, and our voices just sound so silky and sexy all the time.
So fresh.
Yeah, it's true. Okay. We'll spend it on drugs. We'll spend it on cocaine.
In honour of the late Matthew Goodwin.
In honour of the Chat GPT Nazi. Bye, guys.
Layers.
Bye.
This is an Amper Sounds production.